I'm Mark Branson. This is week 3 of Missional Churches and Leadership, and there are 2 brief videos to introduce what we're doing this week. Our theme has to do with the gospel, engaging the gospel, and how do we engage critical reflection on our theological praxis, because we have certain ways already of practicing the gospel, how we live the gospel in our lives, in our church, in our context. And so critical reflection, as we've already been saying, is one of the primary frameworks for the entire course. So let's look at those frameworks. We've talked about critical reflection as how do we use a mirror. When we look in a mirror, we see ourselves, and the way that the mirror reflects back to us. But then what the mirror is in critical reflection is what matters. And we're using this action reflection mode, that our activities and then how we reflect on our activities is the primary way that we actually learn, both personally and as a group. Practical theology then becomes a guide to this method. It helps us remember what to pay attention to. So in addition to the theological assumptions across the top, we've said that we use culture, our current culture, and that gives us things to look at as well as ways to look at what it is that our practice is. The Christian texts, biblical texts, theology, church history, the practices of the church through the centuries. These are also ways that we get to reflect on our current situation. We look at those and we may see things we had not seen before. The same thing about our stories, our personal stories and our group stories. So all of these give us ways to reflect upon how we currently, for example, practice the gospel. How do we practice it in our lives, in our gatherings together, and in our community, in our neighborhood, with our neighbors and our world. Clement Sedmak's first thesis was theology is an invitation to wake up, to be mindful and attentive. And that's what critical reflection is about. How do we wake up? And so the other framework that we use that's part of practical theology, as we talked about last week, we're in the midst of society, and it has powerful influences on us and even on our theology, including how we understand the gospel. The same thing about our cultures. Our cultures have shaped how we understand the gospel. And our communities themselves, how we've used that word for talking about our church life, and our churches and the way they are engaged with God. These are all aspects, these are all social groupings, these are all ways that meaning and influences are understood. And so that's why last week we took more time with social theory. And so this week, as we continue to work on missional theology and leadership, we're going to explicitly look at the gospel, what it is. We'll do theological reflection on that topic. And in the next brief video, we'll look more specifically then at this question of engaging the gospel.